Privilege and also quite humbling to be sitting here next to these two gentlemen who have given so much of their talents and of themselves in service of our republic over long and distinguished careers in public service. In the interest of brevity, I will not recite all of the achievements and contributions that these two gentlemen have made to our republic, but I would like to highlight a couple things about each one that I think are particularly interesting. A thing that I think is most interesting about Senator Hagel is that very early in his career of service to our republic, he was a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army, squad leader in Vietnam in combat. This is a role that's very important to me personally. And the way I see it, the non-commissioned officer in the United States Army does two main things. First, he or she leads young Americans by example, by showing them what right looks like, doing it always, and showing them how to do it themselves. And that's crucial. But most crucially to me, another role that the non-commissioned officer has in the United States Army is to provide honest, unvarnished advice to officers based on experience and common sense. And I can say with a lot of confidence that I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now were it not for a lot of good, honest, unvarnished advice from a lot of non-commissioned officers with a lot of common sense and experience. And I think that kind of advice, that kind of common sense, speaking truth based on experience is something that's distinguished Senator Hagel throughout his long and distinguished career. Which has led him at this point to be the chairman of the Atlantic Council, and his current position as distinguished professor at Georgetown University, where General Jones was a distinguished student and a somewhat distinguished basketball player as well. And one thing that I'm thrilled to claim I have in common with General Jones is that both he and I graduated from the School of Foreign Service, the few years. And a few years separation. And another thing we have in common is that we led platoons in combat very soon after graduating from the School of Foreign Service. And while my education there, and no doubt General Jones, was a wonderful education, we weren't quite prepared to lead soldiers or Marines in combat. And we were both fortunate to have non-commissioned officers like Senator Hagel to help us through, to teach us what we needed to know, and to mentor us. And based on the enormous success that General Jones had in his career, I imagine that he has had the wisdom to take a lot of sound advice from a lot of good non-commissioned officers over the course of his career, which included being a platoon leader in combat, a company commander in combat, a battalion commander of Marines, a regimental commander of Marines, a commander of a Marine Expeditionary Unit, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and eventually, at some point, General Jones did something that's analogous to the way Europe's transition has been described in the Defense Strategic Guidance. As Europe made this transition from a net consumer to a net producer of security, General Jones made a transition from being a net consumer to a net provider of advice, ultimately advising the President of the United States as his national security advisor. And one thing intellectually that Senator Hagel and General Jones have in common is their belief in the importance of institutions, their humility as leaders, their ability to take advice and give advice when required. And so I think that the great strength that they're both bringing to us today is an ability to discuss the United States' position in the world, the United States' relationship with its allies, in a way that respects those institutions, doesn't see them as constraints on American power, but sees them as enablers for United States influence. And without further ado, I will let Senator Hagel begin discussing the role of the United States in NATO in particular, but in institutions in general.
Well, Major, thank you. High honor to be sitting between a general and a major. That's probably why you put me in the middle, so I can dispense good common sense to both of you. Let me begin.
It's actually because it's easier to control you this way.
Well, he's a Marine. That's it. General Jones is every bit as good and complete and dedicated as the Major noted, and I want to thank him for all of his contributions to our country and the world, and also the Atlantic Council over a number of years. So, Jim, thank you very much. And to you, sir, for your service, your past service, your continued service, and how you will, like so many young people here, this is why we do this. That's why we have the Young Atlantists. So you will be prepared to shape a better world and make a better world. And that, in the end, is what service is about. I would begin with just a couple of observations about the world and how, as you had noted, institutions and alliances fit into this very new, unpredictable, combustible, dangerous, but yet very hopeful world. 7 billion global citizens now share the Earth. It will soon be 9 billion. If there was ever a time when alliances and coalitions of common interests are going to be important, it is now and into the future. Nations, regions, individuals will always have differences. That's not an issue. Generations are always faced with challenges. That is not new. It's always a matter of how we manage those issues and differences and challenges. It's a matter of how we respond to each. It is always the objective of leaders and alliances to manage these difficulties onto a higher ground of solution possibilities and eventual resolution. And when you look at the complexity of the world today, as everyone in this room knows, because this room is full of people from all corners of the earth, different religions, different dimensions, different tribes, different attitudes, different colors, different sexes, everything. Each of those differences must be respected. Dignity is the anchor of mankind. Each person deserves dignity. They deserve an element of tolerance. Each person and country and region is important. Now, if that's the predicate that we move forward on, and I think it is for most people, most countries, then again, the issue is how do you do that? Well, you do that by bringing together alliances and you shape these coalitions of the common interests of what improves a society, an individual, stability, security, possibilities, jobs for your children, a better life, clean water, food, medicine. I don't think there are any differences there because of religion or because of anything else. Almost all people on earth want that. There are those who have a different view of the world, the extremists, those who would use these differences to continue to drive confusion and complexity and confrontation. The only way I believe that we can all, as a global community, move forward, as we are now anchored completely in this global economy, is through these alliances. In NATO, for example, Transatlantic Alliance, are but two. I think, too, when you look at that reality and survey the landscape further, you recognize that, like throughout history, every institution gets to a point in its life where you have to make adjustments with the realization that maybe your institution is no longer relevant to today's challenges. I think NATO is a good example of the tough questions that NATO had to begin answering, which really never answered after the implosion of the Soviet Union. The question was, and General Jones knows an awful lot about this because he led NATO, what is the mission of NATO? Is there a future for NATO? Why do we need NATO? What's the point of NATO? That answer never came, and it really got parked, essentially. And in its place, we took the broader focus of NATO enlargement. And so for many years, we enlarged NATO, and I was a strong supporter and still am of that for a lot of different reasons. But it was not driven by security. It was driven by economics more than anything else. The credibility that it gave these new NATO nations to wear the imprimatur of member of NATO was hugely important for their economic prosperity and future and growth, if for no other reason than having that ability and part of that country's position in the world to say I'm a member of NATO brought more confidence to investors, to others who would look at those countries as potential investments and potential countries with opportunities. So we're back again to essentially the same kind of a question, even though the glue of all of us essentially, most of the 28 nations of NATO being in Afghanistan, but that is coming undone because more and more NATO nations will be out of Afghanistan, some by the end of the year, certainly almost all of them by the end of next year. That glue has held NATO together, but then NATO is going to be dealing with the question again. Well, what is the role of NATO? You've got budget issues, and you know the whole entire inventory of these things. Well, not to get too far down into NATO, but let me make my closing point this way on alliances. I use the NATO example as just but one example of institutions essentially born after World War II, most nearly 65 years old, under tremendous stress today in the world because the question becomes for all of them. The United Nations, IMF, World Bank, every institution out there born after World War II, which has been, I think, very important for the world, to keep the world together with all the problems we've had. These institutions are under stress because, like always, are they capable of dealing with the new kinds of problems, with the new kinds of issues, with the new kinds of challenges? Do we need a new institution? Do we need less institutions? Do we need to change some of the institutions? It's always a matter of adaptation. It's a matter of recognizing the realities of how do you accommodate and adjust. And therein, I think, lies what most of the young people in this audience are going to be dealing with for many years as we set this up and then we go forward. I'm confident that that accommodation adjustment will be made. It'll be made because it's so clearly in the interest of Russia, of China, of all nations. Last point. This magnification, which I think was a bit unfortunate and a bit over-exaggerated, of somehow the United States was pivoting from Europe to Asia, that's not right. When you really analyze what the strategic doctrine, the strategic interest, the strategic direction of our defense capability was saying and doing, and what it's about was recognizing the shifts in the world order, because we are living through a time when we are building a new world order. And obviously, Asia has always been important to the United States. Europe is important to the United States. It's not a false choice of either or. And the repositioning, the restructuring, the rebalancing of intelligence resources that adhere to and connect to those new strategic interests, all driven, by the way, economics, because the fundamental security of any nation is your economic strength. There is no strength, there is no security without economic strength. And if we don't get that right, the rest won't matter. The new issues of cyber warfare really now are going to dominate, I think, as much as anything. So I hand this over to Jim. I'm hopeful about this, and I'm hopeful because I think our structures, our people, what we've got to build on, to work from, are so good. It won't be because, if we fail, it won't be because there's some galaxy of celestial beings out there that are dictating to the world, your time is up. It'll be our fault. We will have failed because we didn't do what we had the capacity to do at a time when the world, with all these problems, has more capacity. The world has more capacity to deal with these problems than at any time in the history of the world.
John Jones?
Sergeant, that was great.
Thank you.
You know, my favorite saying is that if we didn't need sergeants, we wouldn't need generals, and that's a true statement. The world needs sergeants. I agree with everything Senator Hagel just said. I think we're at a very strategic moment on the planet. I've talked a lot about the differences between the 20th and the 21st century, and I completely agree that our institutions, both national and international, are very much at risk if they cannot pivot into meet the challenge of the 21st century, which is so dramatically different than it was in the 20th century. It's a much more asymmetric, multipolar world where multilateral relationships are on the rise. It's a world where, as Senator Hagel just said, economic realities have to be at the forefront of anything you hope to do. And therefore, what constitutes the international security portfolio is different than it was in the 20th century, where armies played a huge role in global wars and regional wars. Alliances like NATO that I submit now have to include the private sector more than ever before. And that's why this audience is so important, because the threats that we face in the 21st century, that you will face, will require the unity and some cohesion between the public and the private sectors of all of our countries. And that the composition of an organization like NATO, therefore, also has to change somewhat to face the realities of the 20th century. Or the 21st century. One of the key features, at least in my mind, about the difference between the utility of NATO in the 20th century and the 21st century is that NATO in the 20th century was conceived to be a reactive alliance. It was always going to be a defensive alliance. We were always going to absorb the first strike and then retaliate with mutually assured destruction, which was enough to keep the worst of anybody's imagination as to what bad things could happen in the 20th century from happening. But this is a different world. This is not the 20th century anymore. This is a world where competition, global competition, I mean that in a healthy way, is going to be at the forefront for the foreseeable future. We have rising economic powers like Japan, China, Brazil, India, the European Union. We have economic realities that really bind us all together. The world is much smaller, and NATO will have to think about where it fits, as Senator Hagel said. In my view, the utility and the mission set of an organization like NATO for the 21st century should be that it should become proactive as opposed to reactive in the 20th century. Now, by proactive, I don't mean preemptive. I mean proactive in terms of engagement. Because if you buy into the theory that the combination of our public and private sectors working together can, in fact, make the world a safer place and a better place. And if you look at an organization like NATO and its potential as a bridge between the developing world and the developed world, there's an awful lot of things that we can do to prevent the future Iraqs and Afghanistans from happening on the global playing field. And that takes strategic thinking. It takes a vision for the future. Sun Tzu said, and I think quite correctly, that a strategy without tactics is the slowest road to victory, but tactics without strategy is a noise before defeat. And we tend to be very tactical in how we think, because the pace of activities around the world is very rapid, and you have to, if you're in the government, you have to deal with tomorrow, or maybe the day after tomorrow, but you don't have a whole lot of time to think about, 2 weeks from now, or 2 months from now, or 2 years from now. But because of this pivot of the difference between the two centuries, the one that you're inheriting, we really do have to think about how we respond to the challenges that face us. Many of these challenges are economic. They're very asymmetric. We see certainly a clear threat to the world that you will lead has to do with the fusion of organized crime, narcotic trafficking, and terrorism working more closely together as a functional organization that attacks us all very asymmetrically. We have to figure out what we're going to do as developed countries, for those of us that are developed, but to help developing countries make the right choice between radicalism and progress and freedom and opportunity. The Arab Spring is not going to be restricted to Arab countries. There are other countries that will have young people who want a better opportunity and better future for themselves and their children and their grandchildren, just like we did. That's a phenomenon that properly handled could be a tremendous force for good things to happen on the planet. But it isn't going to happen by itself. It's going to take organizations that are intelligent enough and willing enough to shift and to recognize the environment they're in and adjust to that environment. And I think that an organization like NATO, with a new strategic concept that was unrolled or unveiled at the Lisbon conference, is admirably positioned to pivot in that direction and make a substantial difference. And there are things that are going to have to change. I mean, I personally believe that the Partnership for Peace program ought to be reorganized, and that we should have a track for countries that want to become members of NATO with very clearly defined standards of what it takes to become a member, and we should have another track for countries that simply want an association with NATO, don't want to become members, but want to have interoperability in terms of taking on problems around the world, so that we can talk to each other, we understand how we do things. But it's going to take, I think, this fusion of, on the one hand, military capability where security is required to solve a particular problem or to prevent a future regional war from happening, or perhaps even worse. It's going to take an economic portfolio that will be measured up right next to that security pillar, and it's going to take a governance and rule of law effort that can be also meshed with these other two pillars, so that you can apply the right amount of presence where it's needed. And I think if we can do that we owe it to the developing world to give them that opportunity. The world is much too small, but yet there are so many problems on it. There's no one nation anymore that can do it all. And I think as I told Fred Kemp not long ago, I said, the bumper sticker for what we do is the bumper sticker of a now defunct American Airlines called TWA, Trans-World Atlanticism. And Trans-World Atlanticism doesn't mean that it's just restricted to North America and Europe. It is a philosophy and a way of life and a value system that other people would like to have. And that's what really a lot of the Arab Spring is about: more opportunity, more freedom, more engagement with how you're governed than what they currently believe they have. So we have an organization that already exists that encompasses 28 nations. It may grow to more. It has many partners, and it can do a lot of things. And I think that the future potentially for Atlanticism writ large, with your participation, the private sector's participation, is dynamic. But it is not simply just a military organization. If NATO is simply a military organization that you call when there's a fire, it's already too late. And I really believe that by being proactive, it's cheaper. It's certainly cheaper in terms of resources and lives. And if you can prevent future conflicts by strategically engaging early on, then I think the world will be a better place, and I think the probability of future conflicts will be vastly diminished.
Can I ask folks who have questions to make their way to the microphones? Gentlemen, I have a lot of questions to ask you, but I'm quite confident that you're probably going to get better questions from the group. So I'm going to cede my prerogative as first questioner to my colleagues out here, and we'll start on the left with Ben and then move our way across.
Senator General, thank you very much for honoring us here. My name is Benjamin Bilski from the Netherlands, Young Atlanticist delegate, and also the author of Towards Grand Strategy for an Uncertain World. One of the questions we dealt with when we wrote that book was partnerships and enlargement, and that NATO does not seem to have a strategy in that regard. There's the inner circle of our members, there's a second wider circle of partnerships, and there's a third circle of external ad hoc relationships on a case-by-case basis. A lot of the enlargement in most recent years seems to have been pushed by certain countries who really pushed their favorites onto the membership action plan. I was wondering whether you had views on whether NATO should have a proper strategy on their structures of partnerships and enlargement, which then could have a proper global reach, including into the Asia-Pacific region, not just limited to getting Asian countries or Pacific countries to participate in Afghanistan, but maybe more of an institutional relationship with Pacific regional organizations. Thank you.
Well, from my standpoint, I think I just said that I think the whole partnership structure should be reevaluated. It's done a great job. It was useful, but it hasn't really been modernized. And I do think that there was this gallop towards enlargement, within the last decade or so. It is what it is, and we have to live with it. But there are certainly some lessons that you can learn, and I think one of the lessons that I learned is that for future NATO members, there ought to be a very clear delineation of what is required for NATO membership. And it ought to be codified. I mean, in terms of the society, in terms of rule of law, in terms of economics, in terms of contributions that the country in question or countries in question could make to the alliance. People who become members of NATO should bring value to the alliance. I honestly believe that countries who seek to be members should be willing to elevate themselves to a standard that makes the alliance want to have them. On the other hand, there are quite a few countries that don't desire to be members and want to have interoperability relationships, and those things ought to be carefully codified and written as well. But to have them all lumped together is not is messy, and it's not clear, and it's something that needs to be modernized, and I think it would be very worthwhile for the alliance to do that.
I would just add, I agree with what Jim has said. I would go back to one other point. It's a question I had asked, and it's reflected in what Jim's analysis has been, the role of NATO. I don't think you can get to your questions until you centralize and clarify that question.
Sure.
What the hell is the role?
Sure.
What are we supposed to do? Why do we need NATO? And that has to become, in my opinion, a lot clearer than what it is now. You embroider around the periphery with a lot of interesting, well, what about this and what about the terrorism and so on and so on. But Jim made a very important point about tactics versus strategy. We've really had very little strategic thinking in the United States, and I think Western Europe or Transatlantic Alliance for many, many years, for the reasons Jim mentioned, and I don't mean that as a criticism. The reality of ricocheting from crisis to crisis, when you have the responsibility like Jim Jones did as National Security Advisor to the President, or a President, or any leader, I mean, your immediate crisis is right now, and don't forget, the United States has been in 2 wars for the last 12 years. That is not conducive to strategic thinking, and we're not even sure why we're in the second war now. It wasn't for the same reason we went in 2001. But that aside, this is going to take some pretty deep thinking, in my opinion, to get to where we need to be. I agree with Jim's point about the wider scope of this. I mean, I could envision a lot of different scenarios where you could have a pretty wide scope here of membership, but they've got to be driven by what is the purpose. And that has to be clear to everybody. I don't think you can fit a model on top of any nation, for example, in the Middle East today, and say this is the doctrine. I'm not talking about doctrines. I'm talking about the purpose of that alliance, the purpose of that institution. And I think you can find a lot of ways to bring together interests that would actually articulate a common interest for the role of NATO. But there's where you have to start, because if you don't get that clear, then you're just going to have add-ons here that'll make no sense, and it'll get worse. And then Jim knows this better than almost anyone. NATO is a consensus organization, and 28 different countries with different varieties of everything. It's pretty hard. I mean, Libya is a good example. Often Libya is referred to as a good case model for future intervention. Well, I think just the opposite. Only about 8 nations in NATO participated, and actually most of the assets came from Persian Gulf countries, aside from the United States. Now, that's not a criticism, but I think that's just the reality. Many members of NATO, good-sized ones, didn't want anything to do with Libya, thought it was a mistake to put NATO in there. I think we make a mistake, we all do, when we kind of tamp that down and we put the facade over it that somehow that was the right way to do it. And of course, as the old saying goes, the proof is in the pudding. Where Libya ends up, no one's quite sure. We may have a far worse situation in Libya than we had a year ago. I don't know. So these are big, big issues. Keep writing and keep thinking, because it's going to take that kind of intensity. But I think we'll find a common denominator and hit a new center of gravity on this. These things do come together, but you can't do it when you're involved in war, and when all you can think about for a nation like the United States is you got 100,000, 150,000 troops in places, and you get bogged down in these areas, and then you bring NATO in to help you. And that was the other part of this too. We've lost some credibility. If you remember when we went into Afghanistan, our government said, we don't need you boys. We'll handle it. Let the A-team handle it. You remember that? That didn't go a long way in enhancing our relationship with our NATO partners. Then we have to later ask NATO to come in and help us. Yeah, those are factors we like to glide over, but they're ugly, but they're honest. And we better get, as my old friend Bob Kerr used to say, let's get honest and get real. And I think that's where you start with this. And that's coming from a strong supporter of future of NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance.
Thank you.
Ahmed.
Ahmed Wahid, Young Atlanticist from Afghanistan. It's an honor meeting you, sir. I have 2 questions which are region-specific. One question for Senator Hagel and one question for General Jones. My question for Senator Hagel is, do you support the U.S. strategic partnership as a senator? Do you support the U.S. strategic partnership with Afghanistan? And also, do you think the Senate share President Obama's move of signing this strategic partnership. And a question for you, sir. As a former security advisor, do you think the U.S. war in Afghanistan goes in a right or progresses in a right pace as you have predicted it when you were the security advisor for President Obama? Thank you.
You can start since I just talked. Okay. Plus, I need to think about what I'm saying. I'm just a sergeant.
Well, thank you for that question. I do believe that that the strategy that was embarked on at Lisbon, where the alliance came together on the 2014 transition, was something that needed to be done. And it also responded quite clearly to President Karzai's own desires that it be done by 2014, that he first put forth at the London conference before the Lisbon conference. So I think on that score there was a meeting of the minds, both internationally and bilaterally, with regard to Afghanistan and the United States. And so my answer is that I think that we're doing the right thing. We'll have to wait and see how it all works out, but if everybody understands what is going to happen and works hard to get it done, and there's the will of the Afghan people is respected, and that is in consonance with what they want, then we should be working the way we're working. I do have a fear, though, that unless and until we have a better visibility as to what Pakistan is really going to do with regard to their safe havens for terrorist networks, that the probability of diminished violence in Afghanistan becomes not as good as we would like. That the odds of continued violence, unfortunately, remain high. But that's a problem that I know people are going to be working on between now and 2013, 2014, as we get to that point. But at the end of the day, I mean, the Senator and I both were in Vietnam at the same time, and I was 23 years old and went and came home in late 1968, and as a young first lieutenant, somebody had asked me if I thought that the South Vietnamese effort was going to be successful. I would have said no, simply because I didn't, and I wasn't in the people-to-people program, but I was kind of convinced that the people of South Vietnam, if they were to face the North, that they would not be successful on their own terms. And when we withdrew our aid to the South, we saw exactly what happened. But so my first lesson in my military career was, listen to the people, watch what they say, and the two main rules are: don't make any more enemies than you've already got, and don't do anything that's not good for the people. And so I think we're approaching that point where, regardless of what we do, it's really what the Afghan people are going to want. And if they want what we're offering, then it's going to take courage, the sacrifice, and bravery to stand up to that. And if they're able to do that, then I think it'll go the right way. But without the people, it's not. It's going to be what the people want.
I agree with everything General Jones said, and I'm glad he made those last points about the people and used Vietnam as an example. Every situation is different, we know that. But the premise is exactly the same. I mean, we could stay there for 20 years. A lot of countries stayed in Afghanistan for many years. And when they left, it went to where the people wanted it to go. And that's a fundamental point that we've got to always remember. As to more directly your question to me, I think President Obama made the right decision, and I think generally framed the issues in the agreement with President Karzai the right way. the implementation of all those pieces are uncertain and unknown, and all the question marks are there, and how long, and the money, and I get all that. But that also corresponds to the people point that the General made in each specific country, also with our country, the United States. And that means specifically the Congress. Because the Congress funds or doesn't fund everything. And the future is, I think, is uncertain. But I don't think the President had any choice here, essentially, in saying what he did, flying to Afghanistan, signing a document, an agreement, taking it up, obviously, here at NATO, because that's the number one issue, because we've got 40, 50,000 NATO troops plus 100,000 of ours there. And this is a long way from being over, as you know. But I think I just, in my answer, by going back to General Jones's point, in the end, it'll always be the people decide how much sacrifice are they willing to put into whatever it is they want. I know that's imperfect. I know there are outside forces. And the other point I would make and reinforce what the General said is Pakistan. I've always believed, and I'm no expert on any of this, I've always believed that the future of Afghanistan is directly tied to Pakistan. I think for pretty obvious reasons. And if that can't get put back together, the Pakistan relationship, and it's very dangerous, I think, right now, and getting more dangerous, then Afghanistan is always going to be tied to that. It is always going to be hostage to that. And then, of course, on the other side is Iran. And I think you can never go into these things, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, thinking that somehow you're going to be able to contain your policy in a country-by-country way. It never works that way. These are regional issues. These are dynamics that flow in and out of these countries, religion and tribe and everything. You can't separate any of that. And where it is probably as dangerous a place in the world. I think that intersection of China, India, and Pakistan, 3 nuclear powers, is about as dangerous a place as there is in the world. And there's a lot of unpredictability up there. So I know I probably didn't inform you much on my answer, but I think it's that complicated, and you surely understand it.
Thank you for the panelists for their service to our country. My name is Lawrence Cochran. I'm here with the International Model NATO run by Dr. Nwanze at Howard University. My question is, what is the difference between proactive and preemptive?
I always get that question. And it's a good question. It's very fair. A preemptive strike to me is an action you take in order to gain a tactical or strategic advantage over a certain adversary. And so in the military jargon, preemptive strike is something you do in advance of something you know is going to happen anyway, so you try to get the edge by doing it early. Being proactive has a more transitional quality to it that doesn't necessarily mean direct military action. For example, the type of proactivity I envision for the alliance could be in the Middle East, for example. And it doesn't mean that you're talking about European forces and American forces imposed in the Middle East. The Alliance has an organization called the Mediterranean Dialogue, where 7 different countries, including Israel and several Arab countries, sit together, or they used to sit together and talk and get to know each other. This is one of the things that an alliance like NATO can do, is bring people together, bring the military leaders together, bring the heads of state together, the foreign ministers, the defense ministers. On the military side, work towards interoperability and better understanding. It's a lot easier to deal with the world's problems when you can pick up the telephone and talk to someone that you know. I mean, that you've had a meal with, who's you've shared family histories, you visited each other's countries, you've trained in each other's bases. You belong to an organization like the Marshall Center in Germany, for example, where young leaders of political leaders and military leaders, East and West, get to know each other, and as they rise in their respective professions, they can pick up the telephone or send an email because they know these people, and these organizations make sure that there are the social networks that keep them together, so that the possibility of interaction is better. So the proactive side of a future NATO mission, to me, is not just relegated to the military. It's relegated to the private sector. It encompasses issues that didn't even exist 25 years ago, like cybersecurity, energy security, problems associated with water, and problems associated with health, that a combination of the best of what we all have to offer, working together, can prevent, say, a worsening of a situation as a country slides into radicalism, terrorism, or having to exist on drugs or crime or whatever. But it's this combination of the three pillars applied in the right way: security, economic development, governance, and rule of law, that can help bridge the gap and turn countries that maybe 7 or 8 years from now would be on a steep downward spiral towards conflict, and maybe pull them out and reverse the course. To me, it's a lot cheaper. It makes sense. I understand that a lot of people will say, well, nobody's going to want to spend money on a theory. You may be right, you may be wrong, but I think if you think strategically, you can pretty much pick out some of the spots on the planet where if you don't do anything now, it really is going to get worse. And then you're going to be scrambling to fix it, 10 years down the road. And I think there's a better utilization of our agencies, of our systems, the ones we built for another century, to turn them into the wind of the reality of the 21st century.
Nathan.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Senator Hagel, I'm from Nebraska. I'm Nathan Dorn. I had the privilege of voting for you in 2003, so thank you for being here.
Give that man another drink.
I want to ask about the problems. Nebraska faces as we move to the Big Ten in the football conference. However, I'm going to focus my question looking ahead 40 years. President Obama at the G8 Summit announced he brought the point of food security to the forefront in our country. And in the next 40 years, our global population is going to move from 7 billion to 9 billion people. I was just wondering, what role does the United States have to play in food security, and how can we assure that the food we produce is safe, and how can we assure the rest of the world that the food we produce here is safe? Getting over the stereotypes and the biases that people have, and not necessarily biases, just misinformation. The several hundred questions I've answered this week, being a farmer, how do you know that what I'm producing is safe?
Well, thank you, and I could tell as you approached the microphone you were one of the smarter people in the room. It's obvious to me. But, where are you from in Nebraska?
I'm from southeast Nebraska, Adams, Nebraska.
Oh, yeah. Well,
would you all like to talk together?
You don't mind, do you?
Talk amongst yourselves. They'll be back.
We'll come back to you. Don't mind the general. That's all right.
Nobody else did.
We're giving you a forum here, though. Jim knows a lot about this because he was very instrumental in setting up AFRICOM when he was the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, and other things that he's done in his career that you can never separate. The quality of life for individuals, but the basic necessities, and certainly food, fits right up there. You make a good point with the questions. You remember it wasn't too long ago when and still it's resonating out there. We had the genetically modified organisms, the GMO issues, where many of our European friends would not buy our meat and other products. It's their right. They're sovereign nations. They have a right, any consumer, to buy what they want and what they don't want. And I was right in the middle of that during my years in the Senate, obviously, from Nebraska. So what we tried to do was find as many forums, to your point about the questions you've been answering here, there's really no other way to do that in one sense. Forums to educate and inform people about what we're doing. And I think the best answer, when I say what we're doing in America as we produce our food for our people, the best answer I've always found is certainly we here in our country would not be producing food that would be bad for our people. If we thought we were producing cancer-inducing corn, I don't think there are many leaders or many people that would say, go grow more, and let's have more cancer. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. Now, I know that argument alone doesn't hold. I get all that. But there's no short way to do that. Obviously, food security has to include other elements. Water, huge. We've got water issues in this country. Energy, stability, security, all those are part of any discussion when we talk about food and productivity. You guys in this room, and you especially, know that the American farmer is the most productive worker out there in the history of man. How much food the American farmer produces now per capita is, I don't know, you know all the numbers, I don't know them anymore, but is astounding. So I think the short answer to your question is not easy, I get that. But we've got to keep using forums like this to explain what it is, what we're doing, answer questions, be forthright. If you got a problem, acknowledge it. And I think we're making progress with that. There's something else, too. Education, as everybody knows, is so central to everything. And what we do in Nebraska, and you know this, did you graduate from the University of Nebraska?
I attended the university. I did not graduate. I went to Doane College.
Okay. Well, take Doane College, any Nebraska college. We have great agriculture schools out there, probably the finest agriculture school in the world at Nebraska, a water institute out there. All the pieces that connect into this, and we bring, as you know, students in and leaders from all over the world to visit those institutes out there. That really helps because we go out and we show them how we're growing and what kind of fertilizer we're using and so on and so on. And by the way, we've made mistakes too, as you know. But I think the best way to handle all that is to acknowledge it, don't run away from it, don't make excuses. So I know that's a general answer that you can get anywhere, but I don't know if there's any short, quick answer to it.
Could I piggyback on that? Because this is an example of what I was talking about in terms of proactive engagement. The issue of food security is absolutely instrumental and for many parts of the world where there's not enough food. And just the technology of bringing in silos that where you take the oxygen out, replace it with nitrogen, and it triples the life expectancy of the produce. In Pakistan, for example, most of the produce doesn't even get to the market because they don't have the network to help the farmer. It goes bad before they can even sell it. There are ways in which I think we can help these kind of security threats. Basically transform the world and move it towards in the right direction of this trans-world Atlanticism that I was talking about earlier.
These are really bottom line, to Jim's point, value added kind of relationships where everybody wins.
Sometimes you might need security forces to protect it, and sometimes you might not. Sometimes that's just enough.
Thank you.
Seth.
Thanks for your vote.
Anytime.
Back at you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Seth Johnston. I'm a U.S. Army captain. 10 years ago was the first time that Senator Hagel told me as a West Point cadet that I should listen to my sergeants. He reminded me again out in the hallway, and sir, I have not forgotten. Having received your guidance already, I was hoping to direct a question towards General Jones.
I might add that please explain what you're doing and where you're going to be going.
Right now I'm attending graduate school en route to being an instructor in the Department of Social Sciences, following very much in the footsteps of Major Becker, sharing the stage with you, sir.
Mm-hmm. You see, he did listen. Yeah, and here he is, an instructor
Look where he
in West
is,
Point.
alive and well.
And that was all 10 years ago I gave him that advice.
Somebody wants to ask the Marine the question.
All right, go ahead.
My question is about the way that the role of the United States is institutionalized in NATO, and particularly in the role of Supreme Allied Commander. Europe, who of course has always been an American, but has always also been dual-hatted with the responsibility of commander of U.S. forces in Europe. And so unlike the role of the Secretary General, for instance, who has no member state-specific diplomatic capacity in the alliance, how would you characterize the institutional role of the United States as that dual-hatting applies to the position of SACEUR? Do those two sets of responsibilities, SACEUR and Commander EUCOM, do they overlap or do they remain relatively distinct portfolios?
That's a great question. As a matter of fact, for many, many years, there's been an important omission in the title because it's not Commander United States European Command. It should have said European and African because the entire continent of Africa was also in the portfolio of the commander of U.S. EUCOM, except for the Horn, about 7 countries there. But so it goes to show you that here's this enormous continent that wasn't even figured in the title, but the responsibility of a Supreme Allied Commander and who's double-hatted. Now, the reason that works so well vis-a-vis EUCOM is simply because of the Cold War. The United States brought tremendous capacity by virtue of its presence on the European landmass, and enough to link the two billets together, since the days of Dwight Eisenhower. We proposed on my watch that the AFRICOM the African Command be established. My view was that it should have been in Africa, not in Stuttgart, Germany, but we are where we are. But it was the right thing to do. And, as I think the role of the U.S. Forces in Europe is still extremely important from the standpoint of interoperability. We have a lot of great schools there. We actually introduced the concept of NCOs to Eastern Europeans, Russians. On my watch, we brought Russians into Grafenbeer to the NCO schools there. And I remember a conversation I had with the military leader of, I won't say which country, but an aspiring NATO member country from the Eastern, formerly Warsaw Pact. I made a trip to his capital and brought my sergeant major with me, and we explained the role of the sergeant major for the armed forces and the NCOs, and he got very excited about it. We left after a 2-day visit, went back to Brussels. A day later, I got a call from him, and he said, Jim, he says, I've just appointed our first sergeant major of our armed forces. I said, congratulations, that's great. He said, I have a question. I said, what is it? He says, what do I do now? and we built the NCO Corps in that country, and it's flourishing today. So the value of this interoperability and this forward presence is something that our country should value very highly as an incredible honor and privilege. And it's not one that is destined to be there forever. We certainly have no divine right to be there. We are in other countries at their request, not at our request. And the value of working together, whether it's militaries or whether it's diplomats or whether it's businessmen and women, cannot be overstated. And for the militaries, very important to have that connectivity. Secretary Rumsfeld and I used to argue a lot about this because he wanted to dramatically cut forces, and unfortunately it looks like he's getting his wish. not for the reasons that he thought, but for economic reasons and other reasons. But I really believe that the militaries of the world, if they can stay together and work together and learn to trust each other, that we can do an awful lot of things together that'll make our world a better place.
All right, we're going to transition to two at a time. So over here and then over to Benoit.
Thank you. Elizabeth Ferwelo with the Chicago Council Young Professionals. General Jones, you spoke about NATO's role to prevent future conflicts and as a bridge between developed and developing countries. So I'd like to get your thoughts on applications of that in Afghanistan. Do you think NATO should potentially play more of an economic development role in Afghanistan? And if so, what would that look like?
I think it has to. I think success in a place like Afghanistan is certainly not just going to be through the application of military force alone. And frankly, I believe that we wasted a lot of time thinking that the military force, which was very important, would in and of itself cause a condition that we could eventually tackle the rest of it. Truth of the matter is that we tolerated the drug problem, the lack of governance and good governance and rule of law, judicial system that was working, the establishment of the economic sector should have gone on parallel to the security effort. We waited, and this is our fault. I mean, we tried. I don't mean the U.S. fault. I mean the alliance did not really focus on those things and actually demand that these things be done, and it should have been done. And so I think what we're doing now is kind of playing catch up. We announced the 2014 transition, and now we're hurrying to try to not only fix the security sector, but also to fix a lot of other things. And these things need to be done. But I do think that as long as we're convinced that the alliance is convinced that the will of the people is to live free and create a society that has more opportunity for themselves and is based on rule of law, that some sort of assistance from the coalition, not just the alliance, is worth the effort. But I completely agree with, as I said in my remarks, and I want to underscore what Senator Hagel said, is that Pakistan represents a much bigger problem and a bigger impediment right now to our achieving that goal than just about anything else that's going on inside the country.
Benoit?
Thank you very much, the three of you, for your presentations. My name is Benoit Gomis. I am a Young Atlanticist from France, and I work at Chatham House in London. The question is actually very similar to the one that was just asked, but I will ask it anyway. You mentioned the drug trafficking and organized crime as one of the key challenges for the U.S. In the next few years. So what role should NATO be playing to address this issue in light of what you were saying about proactive engagement? And the other question is NATO the best institution as a military institution to address these complex security challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the last conference that I attended as National Security Advisor was sponsored by Russia in Sochi in 2000. Well, it was just a couple of years ago, so about 2010, I think. And that conference drew 45 nations. And the theme of the conference was the coming threat of the fusion between terror, drugs, and organized crime facing all of us. And there was tremendous interaction around the table for 3 days talking about this coming threat, this fusion of these three things, to be a more clear and present danger to all of us. And by way of answer to your question, I didn't mean for it to be just a U.S. threat. I think it's a common threat. So, for example, we know that the west coast of Africa from South Africa to Morocco is a highway, ocean highway, for drugs, for organized crime, and for illegal activities of all kinds, human trafficking and the like. We know that most of the countries on the west coast of Africa are not properly organized to not only work together, but to have any kind of military capacity to defend to know what's going on in their territorial waters. This includes, by the way, fisheries as well, an economic necessity for many of these countries. It would be astronomically cheap to get the public and the private sector working together to build Coast Guard capabilities with off-the-shelf technology to fuse the capabilities of all the countries in Western Africa so they can actually not only have the means to detect what's going on in their territorial waters, but to actually do something about it. I'm not saying that NATO should do it for them. I'm saying that NATO could be used as a training catalyst to bring this about. Very inexpensive. That's the kind of proactive use of the alliance that I think would make everybody feel good. It would certainly make the African countries of the western coast of Africa, as I say, from Morocco to South Africa, and I've been to just about every one of them during my time, and they all said the same thing. We don't know what's going on in our territorial waters. We're being overfished. We've got oil bunkering of serious proportions for those who have oil, and narcotics are coming around from South America, coming around the Horn, and coming up the west coast of Africa, most of it heading towards Europe. So I hope that's an example of the kind of low-cost but high-payoff use of an organization like North Atlantic Treaty Organization that could do something, I think, pretty dramatic.
We got about 2 minutes left, so one last quick question from Alex, preferably the true-false multiple choice nature.
I'm not sure I can do that, Jordan, but I'll do my best. My name is Alexander Slater. I'm a Young Atlanticist. General Jones, you and I met last week, actually, while you were having breakfast at the Hay Adams. But I thought in that kind of genteel early morning environment, it would be inappropriate to ask you this strategy versus tactics question. You both had mentioned the importance of Pakistan relative to the ISAF mission in Afghanistan. We just heard earlier today from the NSC's European director that the alliance is about to complete its first purchase of drones for ISR purposes. All of the Young Atlantists got here today through a Facebook sort of contest where we had lots of discussions, and one of those discussions was about the use of drones, and in particular how the use of drones has an impact on, in particular Pakistan, the local population's view of cooperation with the United States. And so in the spirit of thinking how, if you have the right strategy, you then have to find the right tactics, what about when the tactics you choose to use to execute that strategy step in the way of that completing that strategy? And in particular, I'm asking about how you see the U.S.'s strategy in Afghanistan, or ISAF strategy in Afghanistan moving forward, when it looks like the drone tactic has an impact on its ability to be successful.
I'll conclude with a softball.
Sergeant, you're up.
Yes, sir. Well, I'll give you my take, and then the general can wind it up. First, I think the premise of your question is very important, and it folds right into the larger purpose of what is our mission, not just in Afghanistan but Pakistan, and all the dimensions of those relationships, specifically Pakistan. And your observations, I think, are correct on consequences and how can you be doing this over here and you want to achieve this over here, and so on and so on. This is all part of what I think in responding to your question, what I referred to earlier, that when I said I think we've essentially lost focus on why we're even in Afghanistan. We're in Afghanistan today not because of why we went in 2001. So we have allowed, you can use it in any definition you would like, mission creep or drifting, whatever. And I fear that we took our eye off one of the real central points here, somewhere in between what we certainly did in Afghanistan when we decided we were going to invade Iraq and we pulled resources out of Iraq, and our ambassadors had a hard time even getting their phone calls returned who were in Afghanistan because everything was about Iraq, intelligence and so on. This is a consequence, I think, of that kind of not paying attention or not knowing what you're doing. And now how do you fix it? Drones, and I would say, and I'm no expert in any of this, but I know a little something about it. The drone capability of a nation, of a military, of our intelligence agencies, of our special forces, is going to grow as it has significantly. Just the journal knows a lot about this. Over the last 5-6 years, the capacity of drones, what we use now, we essentially use them as snipers. I mean, you know what I mean. They began as intelligence vehicles and so on and so on. Now, the other part that's going to happen here, it already is other countries are going to and have built similar capabilities. This is going to be the art of warfare in many cases with this new kind of clean shot capability. It's not as clean as a lot of people like to say it is. We make a lot of mistakes, which causes us a lot of trouble. But I don't think you can in any way disconnect our drones and how we're using them, why we're using them, which is the essence of the problem here right now in this town at this meeting. At least what the papers say this morning is President Obama did not meet with Prime Minister this morning or over the weekend, and Secretary Clinton met with him because no apology has been forthcoming and so on. Well, you can get mired down into the underbrush of all of that, but that's a fact. That's a part of the problem here. And so I just use that as an example of the complications that are now flooding into this larger context of why this relationship with Pakistan is important. And these complications are affecting everything. You know the polling numbers there. America's approval rating or positive rating in Pakistan is as low as it's ever been. I think in the latest numbers I saw from Gallup, there was something around the teens. I mean, that's dangerous. There's 150, 160 million people in a nuclear country, and all kinds of relationships are tied to that with the Chinese and so on. So your question is a very appropriate one, and it's something that's going to have to be factored in. I'm sure this administration, Secretary of Defense, others are not only aware of it, are trying to deal with it. I'm co-chairman of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, so I don't have any responsibility for anything, but advisory boards never do. But I know a little something about this, and I can assure you that this administration could have asked your question, and they're trying to deal with the answers, so it's appropriate.
You know, this is really a tough question. I mean, drone diplomacy, if you want to call it that, is definitely job one. I know of nothing that I did in my tenure as National Security Advisor was more frustrating than the outcome that we see today of the Pakistan-U.S. relationship. And I'll tell you honestly, I do not understand it. I do not understand it because it is not logical. The United States in 2009 reached out to Pakistan and Afghanistan and brought them into the tent to help orchestrate a regional strategy that would involve, even India as well, but that we would treat this not as three distinct problems, but as one regional problem, which is the only way to look at this whole problem. You can't. We tried Afghanistan by itself, for many years, and we realized that that's just not the way you do it. So we tried to reach out regionally, and we made commitments to Pakistan that would have transformed the country. I mean, agriculture, farming, water, food, transportation, military equipment, and it was done in the most open way possible. The only thing that was asked was that we asked that Pakistan would show over time that it does not subscribe to safe havens for terrorists as an instrument of their foreign policy, either towards India or towards Afghanistan or towards us. And many times in the so-called drone diplomacy, as it took off, many times a lot of the drones information was turned over to the Pakistanis so they could take care of an internal problem. I mean, the Swat Valley, the intrusions in South Waziristan, they came dangerously close a few years ago towards the tipping point where they would have had a full-scale problem on their hands if they hadn't reacted as they did. We took that as an indication that, we're going to finally get somewhere. But that wasn't to be the case. And it's unfortunate. It is unfortunate because a failure to advance there and a failure to figure out what it takes to solve this tremendous popularity problem that we have, but by the way, which is nurtured from inside of Pakistan. I mean, you could give the Pakistanis all the food that they need, and the American flag, if that was on a shipment, would be taken off. So unless and until you do really form a meeting of the minds between the leadership of that country, and I will emphasize, in my view, the military leadership of that country, then we're going to be at odds, because I don't know that anybody knows what it takes to figure that out, because it's not logical. It's not logical for Pakistan to want to do things that are, in the long term, not in the interest of its people. There are ways in which the Pakistan community, society, culture, economy can be transformed. And I think all of us, many allies in the room, are willing to do that. But it takes a proactive step to say, we reject the idea that we have safe havens, we'll tolerate safe havens for terrorists in our boundaries. If you can't agree on that point, then it's probably no mystery that you don't agree on much of anything else.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, both for having the honesty and candor to identify for us the multiplicity of challenges that we're facing, and for having the generosity to identify some tools that we can use to address those. I suppose our charge is simply to match those challenges to those tools. So I would suggest we all enjoy our lunch, because we have our work cut out for us.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.